Hey, howdy, hey, folks. It is Mrs. Johnson with the Agro Wisdom channel. I did not upload last week. I was sick. My apologies. Numbers down on the YouTube channel. I don't know why I'm green this week either. I'm in the same place I was like a while ago. I don't know why I'm green. So, bear with me. Today, we're talking about tree pruning. Uh, this video I wanted to do last week. And it was prompted by a conversation that I had with my boss at the hardware store, actually. I'm not green now. Wow, okay. Weird. Um, um, about his trees that he has at home, his fruit trees, and my fruit trees on the family property and stuff. And so here's a recap of the mini lesson that he got specifically about pruning things in more detail and better photos. So let's talk about it. There we go. Let's talk about the parts of a tree first and foremost. So we have the trunk down here, or not the trunk, the roots that grow in the ground. Then we have the trunk in the middle. And then you'll see up here it says that we have a double leader. We'll talk about tree shapes here in a minute. And then, of course, we have limbs and all sorts of stuff and whorls um, and suckers and vertical growth. So let's see, where do we want to start? Let's start at the bottom. So roots, trunk in the middle. And of course, we have suckers, which are essentially little limbs or baby trunks, whichever one you would like to call them, that grow out of the ground and they try to grow baby trees off the same tree. And so those are not ideal for producing fruit because they take energy to grow new tree. And so we don't like those. And then we get into limbs, and then you could really hash it out and talk about limbs and primary limbs, secondary limbs, tertiary limbs. Basically, what that means, this right here would be a primary limb, and then like these little offshoots are secondary limbs, and then anything that comes off that would be a tertiary limb, so on and so forth. And as you see, we've got some vertical growth here, also not great. Sometimes those are called water sprouts. Sometimes they're different depending on the tree that you're talking about. And then you have stubs from where you've cut things. You have whorls, which are like baby branches that, maybe aren't gonna be super protective for you. Um, Water sprouts, those happen. They grow straight up and they don't produce fruit. And they're just like there to try and get sunlight. Um, the trees do that sometimes when they're stressed uh, from water or nutrients, or sometimes when you have a really hot season and it's just like weird weather. Sometimes they just get stressed out and they start doing water sprouts and suckers and stuff. Some types of fruit trees are more prone to this than others. Um, but anyway, and then we have this strong U crotch and a weak V crotch. Uh, when you look at limbs on a trunk, so your trunk is straight, you want like a 45-ish degree, from what I remember. Like you don't want it super flat, like an L, because if it's super flat and this limb gets like super, super long, it just like gets too heavy and it just like breaks. And the same thing happens when you get like super, super tall on that limb. And so it just like gets really tall and then it just like falls off because it's not great. So you want to look at that when you prune things and consider that when you like, especially on new baby trees, like consider what your good angles are, what those crotch angles are, and you measure like this top angle for that. And as I said, about 45-ish degrees is ideal. And then you have like cross limbs. Cross limbs are basically just limbs that like cross over other things and get in the way of like other branches and stuff. Those are not fun. Um, and up here, we have a double leader. So trees have this thing called apical self-dominance in the buds, in the little baby buds up here on the top. And basically, one bud, sometimes two, one or one, sometimes a couple, depending on the type of tree you have, decides that it wants to grow and shape of tree, uh, decides that it's going to grow up, and its entire job for that one bud is to grow upward. And so, depending on the type of tree you want, uh, sometimes you only want one part to grow upward, and sometimes you want like three or four to grow upward. Um, if you're looking for more information on like, I have an apple tree, how do I prune it to be a good shape? Uh, like look at your extension agent offices, your extension offices, and like uh college research and stuff. Like a lot of that is like really easy to obtain information once you kind of know how to prune things. So we're going to talk about pruning things today. Let's talk about more anatomy. This is important when you prune things. So this right here is the trunk. This over here is a limb. I hope you can see my little blue roller thing. This red line is where you would cut. This inside line is your branch bark ridge. And your branch collar is down here on the bottom. When you cut things, you want to cut just above that collar. You'll notice that this is also about a 45-degree angle. This bark ridge doesn't usually, it will be really bad in limbs that are really, really tall. And those bark ridges, once you kind of get an eye for pruning, can be a really good indication. Or even if you're like kind of new and you kind of know some stuff, but you're not terribly sure, if you're seeing a like one or two crazy bark ridges on a tree and they're like weird angles, like consider what that means for the health of that limb. Um, as I said, you're gonna look for that branch collar when you cut whole limbs off. And then we're actually gonna talk about what happens when you don't want to cut a whole limb off, right? Then you're gonna look at like a bud and you're gonna cut 45 degrees in the angle of that bud. Like this left hand side. 45 degrees to the angle of that bud that you're the closest bud that you're cutting to. You don't want to cut too low, too high, too angular. It's not like the end of the world if you don't cut at this 45. It just makes life a lot easier for you and the tree. Like it's not the end of the world if you cut the branch collar for most backyard farmers. Not the end of the world. Um, definitely not the end of the world. Definitely, for the most part, as long as it's like like an older tree, definitely not the end of the world. On a baby tree, you could probably save it. It's gonna take a while because baby trees take a long time to grow. And then this is actually how you cut like really, really heavy limbs. So if you're dealing with like a really old tree, like I was cutting this summer, I was doing a summer prune on apple trees. Do not come at me in the comments. I kind of know, okay, that's kind of a no-no. You don't do huge prunes in the summer. I know this, okay? I know. These apple trees had not been pruned for like 30 years. They were like dying. So I pruned them in the summer. Whoop-de-doo. And they're doing okay. So they're anyway. So if you're cutting something that you're really worried is gonna like tear a limb, like tear into like the main trunk or anything, you can do this first cut and that second cut. And ideally when you do that first and second cut, you'll go all the way through. And so that limb, the rest of that limb is just gonna fall off on that second cut. any of that like excess tearing and stuff on that limb is actually going to be in this stretch. So you ideally, if you're new to it, go like a foot and a half up. Go a foot and a half this direction and do those first and second cuts. Um, and then, you can work your way backwards with these cuts to make a really clean, healthy wound, really clean, minimal wound for the living tree that you've got. Also, don't forget to sanitize your equipment, particularly between diseased trees and in between individuals. Super important. We're gonna talk about shapes. Um, there's a couple different shapes. This is not all of them. You can super nerd out in terms of like fruit tree shapes. Google what's best for the tree you have. Gonna be honest, that's the easiest way to kind of figure out. You as far as I know, you could grow trees in pretty much any shape you want, and it'd be fine. They're still gonna do okay. Like sometimes certain things like to grow like in A shapes or like central leader shapes. Uh, that meaning that there's the trunk goes all the way to the top, and there's like that apical dominance, very traditional apical dominance at the very top, and it looks like a pine tree. And then your like modified central leader um, is similar, but like a little more like round at the top. Your trunk turns into less of a dominant trunk as it goes further up the canopy into the leaves and stuff. And then your V shape, your open center or race shape, basically, you pick like you take the trunk and you divide it into like two or three, or sometimes 4 to 6, depending on how big you expect the tree to get. But 3 or 4 is common from what I've seen. And you just like make like 4 like smaller sections and you make them really wide and really open so it's easy to get like big fruit like peaches and stuff off your tree. Whereas like A-shaped trees are good for like small fruit. And so like that's the kind of thing you want to think about when you think about like shaping your tree of like how easy is it gonna be for me to get into this tree? Like, am I gonna need a lot of space to get this fruit because I have to pick it by hand? If you're a backyard gardener, you might opt for a V shape on something that is traditionally grown in an A shape just because it's easier for you to harvest. Um, or like a modified center that's really open and more like a V shape than an A shape because it's easier for you to harvest. Uh, or you might like the look of A-shaped trees and you're like, okay, cool, I'll suffer with it. I'm gonna make everything look like an A-shaped tree and have one central leader. What to do? Go for you. Great. Um, let's talk about some of the things we want to cut off. Okay? Um, first, we want to cut any growth rising below the graft union. So some trees are grafted on different rootstock. We'll have to talk about that. But any of those suckers, you want to cut those off. Any water shoots, we talked about those. Cut those off. Anything that looks like yucky or dead or diseased or broken, cut it off. And then anything that like crosses is gonna get in the way of stuff, cut off. Those are really obvious, like easy to do prunes of like, is it a sucker? Is it a water shoot? Is it dead? Is it diseased? Is it broken? Is it crossing other stuff? If if the answer is yes to any of those questions, cut it off. It gets cut off right there. So let's talk about some. Ah, I didn't add it. Oh, can I talk about it here? No. So there are. I thought I had. Anyway, there are 2 types of cuts on a tree. There is a whole. I forget the words. There's a like whole cut. So like this water shoot, I would cut like down here on the base, and I would cut it uh like at a good angle towards or at a good angle for that like branch color um on that water shoot, right? So I'd cut it down here against the other branch, against the branch collar, match that branch collar angle, call it a day. This dead branch, though, I might like be able to save it and cut like halfway through, like right here in the middle of the limb. That's a different cut. That's a reducing cut. Oh, yeah. I think these are called reducing cuts, and these are called like elimination cuts or something. Don't quote me on that. Like this crossing branch, I would probably do like an elimination cut. I'd probably cut it all off. Psh. Like this disease branch, probably cut it all off. Psh. This dead branch, maybe cut in half, depending on what it looks like. Okay, let's talk about pruning. I'm going to show you some examples of what a pruned tree would look like before and after, before we do some like exercises. So then you know what to look for. Because I was not in my classes that I took for pruning, they just like gave me worksheets and was like, here you go, prune it. And then we would go over it tomorrow together without like any real uh like explanation as to like any good examples. So, right, this tree beforehand, the first thing I notice is that it's a central leader tree. It's got a main trunk that goes all the way up. I'm not noticing any like um major like leader issues. So I'm gonna leave that be. But like there's definitely a lot of like vertical branches that can come off, a lot of water shoots. Um, and like these suckers can come off, and that's a dead branch. I can cut that branch, as you see. Like when they pruned it, they pruned that entire dead branch off. And then you're left with like this nice, like less crowded tree. Um, so let's take a look at a real life picture. This looks to be like a fairly younger tree. It looks like they've got an open vase kind of shape because there's a trunk and then like the trunk kind of disappears and kind of goes in several different directions. Um, and you can see there's a bunch of like limbs up here. And I know that this is a young enough tree that it's probably not going to produce food for another year or so. And so I'm going to spend the time to cut it into the shape that I want and let it regrow its vegetation next year. Because I'm going to push it into vegetation. Rule of thumb for pruning trees, if you've never pruned it before, don't know its pruning history, take no more than a third of the tree. If you've been pruning it consistently, take no more than 40 to 50% of the tree, depending on how resilient you know the tree to be. So if you've been pruning this tree for like a decade and you're like, yeah, this tree is fine, I can take 50%, or like 45%, I wouldn't take 50%, honestly. I would take like 45%. If I was like really trusted the tree to live through it, but no more than like 45. Right? So that's essentially what they did, is they took like 45, 50% because this is a tree that they've been shaping since it was like itty bitty. Um, and they put their leaders in. They put their 1, 2, 3 leaders, looks like. And they left some secondary limbs on, right? And so, or 3, maybe 4 leaders with some main branches that they wanted to keep, main secondary branches, which is cool. And then let's look at what is enough and what is too much pruning. This tree on the left-hand side, before pruned, you can see this is what like a lot of trees in my area look like because we're not in a like I live in the middle of the forest. So like we don't prune trees. Whereas like when I lived down in Chico, like everything was pruned. Everything looked like this like middle photo, like in the middle of winter, because everyone paid for their trees to be pruned, whether it was like a landscaping tree that they put there to look pretty or a fruit tree. Right. And this is like an open modified leader, maybe an open vase plan, I would say, on this tree, right? And so what did they do? They took a lot of this, like a lot of these little limbs out, and like some of these dead limbs and some of these crossing limbs, to where like now these limbs aren't crossing each other. It's really bare. Now this looks to go from this to this can be scary for new pruners. And I don't have like I'm not going to tell you that I have the most pruning experience ever, but this is like a fairly normal prune. Like this is a healthy prune, honestly. And I think I should talk about this. So when you cut a limb entirely off, where does that energy go now that that limb is entirely off, right? Because it can't go in the limb anymore. So it goes to the rest of the tree. So when you cut a whole limb off, you're going to expect the energy that would have been put towards that limb to go towards the rest of the tree, like overall, because there's no limb left. When you cut half a limb off or part of a limb off, right? Like this, if we were to cut like this left limb, this already pruned left limb because it's easier to see, right? If we were to cut like this little section off, like this little horizontal section off, or like even this little vertical section off, where's that limb? Like, we'll call that a reducing cut, right? Now that we've reduced that limb, right, we can come through and top the edges and reduce the tops very little. Like, what happens to all that energy? That those buds were that tree is going to push towards those buds, right? Well, it's going to go through the rest of that limb because that limb's still there. And so oftentimes when you like cut half a limb, like you'll notice that that limb that you cut on like just kind of skyrockets in like either vegetation or fruit growth. It's kind of depending on all sorts of factors with your tree, but you'll notice that there's like now a lot of excess energy going there because that tree is used to pushing like energy for that limb that used to be there. Versus when you cut like the whole limb off, it like now goes towards like the entirety of the tree. Doesn't really, um, right? Doesn't really, like can't really go into the same place that it was going. Versus like when you cut like half a limb off, it can still go in the same place. So it just like adds more to that one place. Now, when you top a tree, um, like this photo, right? If you were to take this left-hand photo and just like cut everything, you end up like with these uncontrolled, like you end up with these really weird growth spurts because there's what you've probably done is cut so far back that there's no buds, no like when you cut part of a limb off or when you like reduce to a limb, as I showed you, you want to cut to a bud. And you want to make sure that so that bud can like kind of direct that limb, kind of like the apical dominance, but not quite so heavy because it's just at the end of the limb and not pointing up unless it's the top of the tree. Um, and so you want to leave that bud intact, and you want to leave a couple buds before that intact. Um, like I think it was like no more than like a fourth or a third of the limb you want to take. Um, like of the like limb itself. Um, so if it's a like secondary limb, you want to leave 3/4 of that secondary limb If it's like the main limb, the primary limb, you want to leave 3/4 of that primary limb. And as I said, once you start getting these trees acclimated to pruning, you can prune a little heavier. But if you go too fast, weird stuff like this happens, and then you've just like, you're never gonna have a normal tree after that, realistically. So like you can always do a little bit. My recommendation for you actually is to do a little bit of pruning on a tree. Like, I don't know how accurate this is, but just from my experience, I would rather you prune a little bit in the summer, like on unless you have a variety that like really hates summer pruning. Like prune a little bit in the summer, especially if it's like a well-established tree. Prune a little bit in the summer, get some of these like really gnarly clustered limbs out and then just let it grow and just see what happens. Um, don't cut it all the way back to this. You don't have to cut it to like this well pruned area, but you could kind of go like a third halfway in between and just kind of see what happens through the rest of that season. Because you're not worried about taking all that sugar and stuff that it needs to go into dormancy and finish its season. Um, but you still get to see what happens after your cuts. Um, so let's do some practicing. Where would I cut this tree? Honestly, I would probably cut. Actually, let's talk about it. So this is a central leader tree. It looks like there's good apical dominance uh on that trunk. So I'm gonna leave it alone. Uh right. Suckers, water shoots, vertical stuff, and then obvious, like anything that's obviously like weak, dormant, right? So water shoots. I don't really see a whole lot aside from like maybe this one and maybe this one. So I'll take those out because they're also like crossing over things and they're like really tall and they look like they're looking for light. So I'm just going to cut those out. And then I don't really have any like broken stuff aside from like maybe this little limb here. Like that's really crowded. I'll probably take that little limb out. Um, and then I'd probably take some of these like really small limbs that are like just growing straight out. Like this down here on the bottom of this tree, it's like the bottom of this tree sucks, honestly. And honestly, if this was a fruit tree, I might like if I'm considering like this to be like the first like 3 to 6 feet, no, 3 to like 4.5 feet, I might take all these limbs off. Or I might like cut all the bottom limbs and like this to vertical limb. And then I might like cut like these two and see what these two do next year, right? I could always leave a limb on and cut it later. I can't regrow a limb once I've cut it off. So if there's anything that you're like not terribly sure about, you could give it 6 months and then cut it off. You could give it a year and cut it off. Like, it's always worthwhile to do a little less than a little more. Because once you start getting the hang of this thing, you might like end up doing this to a tree and not realizing it. Because you're just like, oh yeah, I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing. Honestly, I would give it a season. Like I would be conservative, take what's obvious, and then if you're ever not sure, leave it. You can always cut it next year. It'll be there next year. If you cut it now, right? Because you're talking about fruit trees and you're talking about potential thing, like if it's like kind of up in the air and you're like, I think it'd be okay. I don't know really how it would grow, unless it's like an absolute no, or like you're really pressed on like space or something. Like if it's an absolute no for whatever reason, like you can leave it for a year. You could leave it for 6 months and do a summer pruning or a winter pruning and you know or put it on your next schedule and be like, hey, I'm gonna, you could even tie a little like string around it and be like, hey, I don't really know about this limb. I want to come back to it like the next time I prune it. Um, After storms, this is um a good thing to talk about. Um, right? Because storms happen, they break your trees. And storms also bring up a good thing to talk about when it comes to pruning. You want to prune in good weather. They make like prune sealer and stuff like that, which is a helpful tool when you know how to use it. Prune sealer, for those of us that don't know, essentially when you like cut limbs, you either paint it on or you spray it on, and it just like works as a band-aid, uh, like uh, like the liquid skin. Um, Kind of like a band-aid. It's more like secure to the tree. You can't wash it off, you can't scrape it off. Just kind of like a glue that glues over um that like wound. Um, which is useful in some contexts, but you don't always have to use it. Um, and so I would do more reading um on whether you need it in your area or not. And it really depends on when you prune too, because humidity causes a lot of fungal infections, and humidity, storms, things of the like, they spread things in trees like no other. So like bacteria, diseases, things like that, they spread really easy in humidity, and they spread even easier with open wounds on trees because there's not usually open wounds. So, I was always told when you prune a tree, make sure that you have a good 2 days before and after your prune to have good weather. Like make sure it's sunny, not too wet. Google it, read some stuff um, for specifics on your trees in your area. Uh, but let's talk about this tree. How would we prune it? Pause the video. Think about it. Do the thing, because I forgot to do that on the last one. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about it now. Okay, so first thing I notice is this looks like either because it's 2D, I'm not terribly sure. It either looks like a modified center, like it's got more than one center, or an open vase tree. I don't think either way really bothers me on how I would prune it. I think I would kind of prune it the same way, given that I know that this tree has a lot of damage from like a storm. Um, so I would definitely, this limb right here has nothing going for it aside from just going straight up. So I would cut that off because I'm going to assume, because there's no smaller branches on it, that there's no buds on it. Um, which means no growth, which means you're gonna get that weird top hat thing if I don't cut it off. Uh, and there's so much energy going to that limb, so I'm gonna cut it off. And this limb is broken, and so I kind of like the idea of cutting it where that arrow is. Um, and then I'm just gonna go through and look for those like dead, um, they wouldn't be water suckers in this situation, but like those dead spaces on the limbs, and I'm gonna cut those off, right? So like you could cut it here, you could cut it here, you could cut it there, you could cut it there. Beyond that, not, if I was just pruning this tree, right, what other limbs would I take? Well, honestly, this back limb up here, hmm, depending on where it's growing, I might take it because looks it's like really thin and weird and looks almost like it was like a water sprout that like decided to branch out up here. And that's really tall to be like, if this is like a little tiny baby tree, I'd leave it. But if this is like a 15-foot tall tree, I'd probably take that limb and be like, actually, no, don't be that tall. Just because of the way I like trees. Um, and this limb here that goes up this way, I'd probably take that one. Or at least like I'd reduce cut it. I'd like reduce it over here. So it's not like running over this way. Um, yeah. This little hanging limb here, I'd probably leave for the next season and see what it does. I don't really like it. Like this one also bends over. I don't really like that. I'd probably take this one though. And I'd probably take like that little limb. Probably cut. Probably reduce those. Cut the edges of those. And then I'd probably call it good. I'd probably leave it alone for the year. Um, and see what it does. So, honestly, I think the easiest way for me to practice was to like draw crazy trees. Thank you for yapping with me. But yeah, as I was saying, I think the easiest way for me to practice, when I was not terribly confident or didn't have access to my own trees, was to just draw trees on paper and then like draw like the craziest trees that I could find or like trees that were like kind of good but had some bad things. And I just like think about what I wanted that tree to look like and kind of like where fruit would grow and where it maybe wouldn't grow and what would kind of be bad. Like, now when you prune trees, remember that those cuts are going to be there. Um, Oftentimes trees now last like 30 years commercially, but if you're in a backyard, like that tree could last upwards of like 150 years, right? So if you just planted a brand new baby tree and you're like shaping this tree and you want it to be amazing and wonderful, like consider that. Like, is this a tree that you're gonna pull out like when your kids are born, when your kids are adults, like, or is this like a tree that like your grandbabies and great grandbabies are gonna play on? Like, and think about like the lifespan on that tree and like what you want that tree to do. Do you want it to be a shade tree and also a fruit bearing tree, or do you want it to like just exclusively like make fruit, you know? And so like kind of think about that and like consider what that might look like for you and your tree and all sorts of stuff. So, without further ado, I will stop yapping and I will say thank you. Have a great day. And I hope to see you next week. Hopefully, I'm not sick again. And yeah, have a lovely day. I hope you learned some stuff. Bye.